Okay, thank you. All right, let me get this set up properly. Give me a second. Okay. Can you all see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. And I'm moving your beautiful faces over there so that I can see you, those of you who have your video on or have a picture of you there. All right. Great. I see there's something in the chat. Let me quickly take a look. Oh, this is the link to the poll question. Okay. Do we have the answers?
Give me just 1 second.
I was curious where everybody came out. So there was a typo. It should have said, do you think DevOps needs Agile? But I'm sure everybody was able to figure that one out pretty quick.
So far, we have 71% as yes, 14 as no, and 71% as yes, 14% as no, and 14% as sometimes.
Okay. Oh, that's really interesting. I'd be interested to hear. I know that poll stays open for a while, so I'd like to get the results by the time you finish. Close the poll.
You will have UR tagged in it, so you will get them.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. All right. Well, thanks everyone for being here. It's really an honor to be invited back to speak to this wonderful group. I just started as a contractor Agile coach at Spotify, which is really interesting, and I'm enjoying that a lot. I've been in the Agile space for about 8 years, and before that I was in the training field. I actually got into Agile because I had to put together several courses on Scrum and being a product owner and Agile and things like that, and got so fascinated with it that I switched careers and got into being a Scrum Master and coaching eventually, and really love it and really passionate about it. And I've been speaking about Agile too for a while now, and my thoughts continue to evolve. So those of you who may have heard my prior talks might hear some familiar ideas. There'll also probably be some new ideas here, and I encourage you to ask questions and engage as much as you like. I think you have access to the slide deck. Is that right, Mindy? Yeah, she just put it in the chat. So you're welcome to go through that and ask questions about anything you see there. So tonight what I'm going to do is start by describing some of the problems with Agile, and I'll say a little bit about how Agile 2 deals with those problems. And then I'll talk about DevOps and its relationship to agility in a general sense. And then lastly, I'll go over the Agile 2 values and principles and talk a little bit about how they're related to some core DevOps ideas, leaving time for questions at the end. Okay, so I went by that pretty quick. Problems with Agile. Yes, I am very passionate about Agile and I love it. And yes, there are problems with it. And that's how I got involved with Agile 2, is to fix those problems. One of them is that, people think that Agile is Scrum, and Scrum is all there is to Agile. And Scrum is generally understood to be a process, right? It's not a philosophy. It has clear roles and responsibilities and duties for each role. And people will say to me, I need you to show me how to do the Agile process. Or, Lisa, can you just teach us how Agile and Scrum works and leave out the theory? And this kind of misses the point, right? I mean, a lot of people know about Agile. They don't really understand what it is. And I think that's partly because there's not a clear definition within the Agile community about exactly what it is. Now, this here is a funny picture from an article that Chris Lennon wrote for Medium in July in the top there. And Ron Jeffries has put out a lot of material about Scrum and criticizing Scrum. And there's a link to some of his material on the topic. So I am not alone in making this observation. I am far from the last person or the first person and not the last person to have some of these critiques. And, one of the most common complaints I hear from everyone really is if they're on a Scrum team or they work with Scrum teams, is that there are too many meetings and that they don't have enough time to get their work done. And this is an especially acute problem for product managers and anyone who needs to attend ceremonies for multiple teams. Now, in fairness, many meetings come from other parts of the organization. They're not part of the Scrum ceremonies. But when you add in all the organizational demands with stakeholders and other types of informational meetings and so forth on top of all the Scrum ceremonies, from the perspective of someone on a team trying to get work done, it can feel like you have to spend a lot of your time in meetings. And regularly scheduled meetings, especially ones that the team members find pointless and really dread going to, these interrupt flow. And people can't really attend to intense, thoughtful work until they get back into a state of flow. And that takes a while, right? So frequent meetings can be really disruptive. And Agile 2 generally suggests fewer and better meetings, and only when they're needed. So now I'm going to pick on Scrum a little bit. Scrum purists say that we must follow the Scrum guide to the letter, and that if we don't, we're not doing Scrum right, or we're not doing Scrum at all. But the Scrum guide has changed its definition of the Scrum Master many times over the years. And, have you ever wondered why it's okay for some elite people who publish these things to change the Scrum guide, but no one else can change Scrum without violating its essential Scrumminess? I mean, if there was only one right way to do Scrum, then they wouldn't need to make so many changes, and some of them are big changes to such a key thing, like the role of the Scrum Master. And I mean, actually, personally, I think it's great that they make changes because I think things evolve as we discover new ways of working and new ways of doing things. But I really don't think people who learned Scrum a few years ago read the new iterations of the Scrum guide and change their processes, because those folks are too busy building software and like doing things, right? And they're not really that interested. But the Scrum guide actually says there's really just only one way. They have that caveat that they have in there, which is the Scrum framework as outlined herein is immutable, sometimes known as the immutability clause. And if you think about it, it doesn't really make sense that only some people get to say there is only one way. I mean, why can't other people make changes too and customize things for their situation? And I think they can, and they do, in fact. And, it's the idea of shu-ha-ri, developing and evolving your thinking as you go along and making adjustments in response to your situation. So if you ask the question, has Agile failed? You get different answers, and it depends on who you talk to, and of course it depends on where you are. But generally, people who have a vested interest or those with less experience and have just been introduced to Agile on a theoretical level but haven't yet had the opportunity to work in that way, they think Agile is great and that it's really useful. And it does have a lot of really exciting ideas in it. But you talk to developers and other tech team members like UX designers and quality engineers and people who have been in the Agile space or have been subjected to what is considered Agile, even though it might have just been Scrum, but they think of it as Agile, and they've been harmed by these rigid Agile frameworks. And they will tell you privately sometimes that they hate it, that it's just made their lives miserable and they wish it would just go away. And, we don't like to think about this as Agilists, but I think as Agilists, we need to face the reality that we have kind of a branding problem. I met a senior DevOps engineer not too long ago, and he told me that he's never met an Agilist who did any good. Now, he said, I've met some wonderful people who were Agilists, and they were interesting and they had some good ideas, but for one reason or another, they just weren't very useful and they didn't really get anything accomplished in the organizations that he was in. And, I work now with Spotify, and Spotify is arguably the most agile company in the world with 8,000 employees. And there are 28 agile coaches. So you can see that even in a place that's really agile, the need for someone to guide this process is questioned in many circles. And when looking to hire, organizations aren't always sure that they need both DevOps people and Agilists. So if you're in the Agile profession, these facts are kind of hard to take in. But something is going on, right? Something's wrong here. And whether you blame it on Agile or you blame it on how people use Agile, it's not really working the way we want it to. And a lot of times Agilists respond to the crisis using these common phrases. I'm sure many of you have heard these before. The general feeling sometimes in the Agile community is that people who don't like Agile, they don't really understand it. They haven't learned it well enough yet, or they point out that the culture in the organization isn't ready for Agile. And all of these things may be true, but they're not that useful as sort of blanket general statements. And they can trigger defensiveness in the very people that the Agile community is trying to help. Now, more experienced Agile coaches have a more nuanced perspective. They know just how hard it is, and they know that Agile is not the answer to everything. And a mature perspective brings in other fields into the Agile space, like organizational development, professional change management, cognitive science, behavioral psychology, and all kinds of other things. A mature Agilist focuses on business agility, which is the goal of being Agile, and not just to be Agile, but also to get good outcomes for the business, right? Because that's at the end of the day, that's why we're there. Now, there are many problems that Agile addresses really well, and I've listed some of them here on this slide. And, let's remember that 20 years ago when the Agile Manifesto came out and started to spread, it really did bring about useful changes in how software was being built at that time. Agile got people to realize that the waterfall style of projects, software projects, just really wasn't that great and wasn't leading to good outcomes. And they realized that it wasn't possible to design all the requirements up front. Agile argued for small teams that can work really quickly and be nimble rather than large teams, and built quality in from the beginning by testing early for both bugs and integration issues. So Agile brought a lot of value to the world of software development 20 years ago. Later, as the thinking evolved and changed and matured over time, some ideas took hold in the Agile community that actually were not that helpful. And actually, I'm not sure they were really all that Agile either. For one example is that all teams should be self-organizing. Well, what if a team isn't ready for that? Or what if the team simply lacks good leadership? Self-organization isn't necessarily going to solve that. Another thing that comes up in the Agile space is the sidelining of written communication in favor of live conversations and video chat or face-to-face chat, if anyone does that anymore. And this can be really problematic, especially when major technical decisions are not documented, but they took place during a meeting where decisions were made, but they weren't documented and shared widely. Or tech stacks aren't described fully enough for newcomers to figure out how to work with them. And what about all the frameworks? There's a whole lot of them. And I'm a believer in the idea that all models are wrong and some models are useful. So I tend to be framework agnostic and look at them and see what's helpful in them and use what's going to be helpful for a particular case. But one problem with these frameworks is that they're not necessarily aligned with the Agile Manifesto or aligned with what is generally accepted as good practice in the Agile community. So in a way, sometimes parts of them anyway are not really agile at all. And another problem with the frameworks is that they give people the impression that they're complete. That if you're a newcomer, right, and you're just starting out, and somebody gives you this framework, and you reorganize yourselves, and you create all these roles that are listed, and you give each role specific responsibilities and tasks, and you follow the given process, the understanding and assumption people make is that it will be successful. And in truth, all the frameworks require some tailoring. None are perfect for any and every situation and organization. And the frameworks themselves will often say directly, you need to adjust this for your circumstances. You need to tailor it to what you're dealing with. And what I see happen, though, sometimes is people who are new to Agile, they assume that the frameworks are complete and they try to follow them really carefully, and then they're disappointed when they don't get good results. And along with the frameworks and all of their strong proponents, along came tribalism. And everyone here, I'm sure, is familiar with at least some of these tribes. And the Agile community continues to split up into more and more tribes and lines of thought, and have really intense debates with each other about who's better and who's right. Tribes tend to promote their favorite framework over all the others. And, as humans, it's very natural to feel really good when we find our tribe. Because in our tribe, we feel safe, we feel important, we feel like we belong, we feel like we're at home. But there's a dark side to all of these tribal ways of thinking, because they can be arrogant and exclusive. The problem with tribalism is it frames those who disagree with our ideas and the core beliefs as the other, right? And tribe members begin to identify too strongly with their tribe and intentionally close themselves off from new ways of thinking. In other words, they get kind of stuck in a relatively rigid way of thinking. And if you're within the tribe, questioning the tribe can trigger defensiveness, because people in the tribe feel personally attacked. And if you're outside of the tribe and you critique the tribe, well, forget it. People will just discount what you say. And you may have experienced this yourself, when you've asked a really hard question, or you've tried a new approach, or you've experimented with somebody, and somebody said to you, well, that's not very agile. And that's kind of the opposite of the fundamental concept of agility, right? Is that we want to be open and we want to be flexible and experimental. And so these tribes can really get us into trouble. So it just divides us. And, some of you may have heard my past talks on cognitive bias, one of my favorite topics. And with tribalism, I think what happens is we fall prey to the confirmation bias, which leads us to seek out evidence that supports our beliefs and to ignore evidence that doesn't fit in with our beliefs. And the biggest damage, I think, from tribalism in the context of Agile, as we're speaking about it here, is that it prevents us from truly communicating with each other and understanding one another. We can't really honestly retrospect on how Agile is working or not working, or how it needs to be changed, if at all, when we cling to strong, unquestioned beliefs. Now, enough about all of that. What about things that the Agile Manifesto didn't mention? So these are all areas of knowledge and expertise that were well known even back in the 1990s. For example, business data. Data was really important back in 2001, and whole companies specialized in gathering and analyzing business data so that companies could use that, organizations could use it to make better decisions and get aligned on future plans and so forth. But the manifesto doesn't mention data. So there are some things, and there's others listed here, that were not really included in the manifesto. But what we need to remember when we sit here and pile on critiques of the manifesto is that the manifesto never claimed to be the be-all or the end-all, right? It never said, this is complete and this is all you need. It was a way, it the challenge and the problem came up when people impose that way of thinking on the manifesto, that the manifesto is our bedrock and that's really all we need. And so the manifesto, I think over time, was interpreted, reinterpreted, misinterpreted, applied or misapplied. And that's where I think the Agile community got into some trouble. Now, I'd just like to say a quick word about data, because data is just so important today. And you could say, arguably, that data is almost more important than code. And methodologies that, like Agile frameworks, they don't say a lot about data, with the exception of feature-driven development. And, I will ask you, if you think about it, if how many people have heard that your data teams push data to the data lake, but it's not usable for machine learning? So it's because people aren't working with the teams to make sure they understand that when they use Scrum, they also need to figure out how to use other techniques across multiple teams, like domain-driven design, and that maintaining your enterprise data models is really essential if you want to leverage your data as an asset for business intelligence. Data is big in Agile too. We think it's really important. And so all of these ideas, I didn't come up with them, right? I don't claim to have invented them. These were out there in a wide variety of books and lectures and articles, and people have been talking about this. And so the good news is a lot of people have been looking at this and trying to figure out all of this and sharing their ideas. And the Agile 2 book, which I co-authored with 6 other people, and our lead author is Cliff Berg, we are part of a community of thinkers who are trying to tackle these questions and these problems. I didn't figure out the problems either, right? They came from a wealth of information from other people in the community who have been concerned about the trajectory. And some people have seen a lot of value in Agile and are concerned that it's being set aside, and other people think that Agile needs to be changed. So I would encourage all of you who are listening to read widely in books in multidisciplinary way, so that you get a cross section of knowledge and understanding and bring that back to your ways of thinking about software development, whether it's DevOps or Agile or both, right? So my belief is that Agile is essential and DevOps is essential. Now, Agile offers many crucial, like fundamental concepts that we really need, like frequent retrospectives, conducting experiments, working in small batches, and being transparent. So Agile is not irrelevant, but it does have problems that need to be addressed directly, and it needs an update to stay relevant and useful. Now let's talk a little bit about DevOps, which, as I said, is also essential. Now, DevOps was first conceived by Agilists and documented by a group of Agilists, but now it feels like it has moved into strictly a technical practice. And companies hire DevOps experts and create specialized DevOps teams even. And DevOps, as it is practiced generally, not everywhere, but generally, is more about workflow, lean techniques for software development, and testing and operations. And the challenges with Agile that I just went over, which should be, Agile should be helping and supporting DevOps, end up kind of holding it back. And the Agile community focuses on scaling Agile using processes like Scrum, or adapting, Agile. There's like the model SAFe for scaled big organizations with lots and lots of engineering teams. But DevOps also allows you to scale Agile. And so DevOps has gotten traction all on its own, sort of bypassing Agile in some organizations. And I think DevOps is great. I took a class called DevOps for Agile Coaches, where I learned a lot about it, and I actually did a little bit of coding, and I got my own AWS account, and did some testing and had to learn how to keep the pipeline green. And it's a little bit like letting an adult sit down at the piano keys and play the piano so they can hear how it sounds. It doesn't make me a DevOps engineer, but it did give me a lot of understanding and appreciation for what's involved in DevOps. And, it's widely accepted as a really good way to handle managing really large, complex computer systems. And, these systems have a lot of complexity and innumerable dependencies. The original idea of DevOps was more people-oriented, to combine development and operations, to make sure that they work hand in glove and that they communicate well with each other and that they work together in a way where the line gets blurred between people who work in development and operations. They actually, they work together as in one individual can handle both. And so while DevOps provides, the missing technical aspects of Agile, DevOps as it's practiced today generally is more of a technical practice and doesn't really involve theories of human behavior. And that's where Agile comes in. And, like I said before, Agile's got challenges and Agile is not really a silver bullet. So the group of people who got together to create Agile 2, we weren't trying to replace Agile. We were trying to evolve it. We were trying to take all of these ideas and synthesize them and extend the best parts of Agile and include many of the core ideas from DevOps to create a new articulation. And I think Agile can't really scale without DevOps. So for DevOps to work, you need to apply it to the entire value stream, which maybe will extend beyond the development teams, right? And so this is where business agility comes in. And it's essential for people in different parts of the value stream to be able to have meaningful conversations with each other. And they can do that only if they understand each other's domain. And this is why one of the core Agile 2 principles is that people need to understand how their technology, business people need to understand how their technology is built and delivered so that they can have these conversations effectively. I'm going to pause a second just to see if there's any questions in the chat. I don't see anything there. So I will keep going. Okay. So now I'm going to shift a little and talk about the group of people who got together to create the ideas of Agile 2. They're from all parts of the world. We have lots of different skill sets and areas of expertise. We come from different backgrounds. And around when the pandemic began, Cliff Berg, who had been thinking about a lot of these things, decided to form a group of people to essentially hold a retrospective on Agile, to come together and talk about what are we concerned about in the Agile space and how can we improve it. We didn't really set out to create a new Agile Manifesto. It sort of emerged from our conversations. And so over a period of 8 months, we met and we debated every Agile topic you could imagine and examined them really deeply and tried to come up with better ways of articulating ideas that we had read about or experienced in our work or had seen emerge in the Agile community, but that hadn't been written down. And so in a lot of ways, we didn't really invent this, but in some ways you could say that just the act of sitting down and articulating something clearly can actually be a significant contribution, even if each individual idea isn't brand new by itself. And for those of you who've seen my past talks, this next part of these slides will look a little familiar, but I think this concept here is so important that it bears repeating. So what I'm going to do next is talk a little bit about the original manifesto and what we tried to do when we were creating a new set of values and principles. So the original Agile Manifesto is very balanced. It wasn't extreme. There is a very important caveat that often gets overlooked. While there is value in the items on the right, we value the items on the left more. And if you think about that in a literal sense, you could change this wording and you could say, there is value in comprehensive documentation, right? Because there is value in the items on the right. We just value working software more. But there is value in comprehensive documentation. So there was balance in the original manifesto. And I think what happened over time was that the interpretation of the meaning of the values in the Agile community got a little off balance. And so people saw the word over and interpreted that to be really extreme. And they interpreted that to mean that processes and tools are bad and individuals and interactions are good. And the caveat gets overlooked so often that people ignore it altogether, or they just forget about it. And the statement that there is value in the items on the right gets lost. And here's some random examples of visualizations of the Agile values. The first one on the top left emphasizes the items on the left, and also the caveat is missing. The next one at least has arrows, the one below it, but it doesn't have the caveat. And on the right, we see that these two graphics have just dropped the items on the right because, at least graphically, they were implying that they really don't matter and that only things on the left really matter. And how this plays out sometimes is when people try to create a new manifesto in a different topic area or domain area, and they carry over this misunderstanding so that the new manifesto has items on the left that are good and items on the right that are clearly bad, things we don't want. And for example, the marketing manifesto has obvious polarities and presents good and bad ideas as opposites, and the caveat is missing. In the personal agility manifesto, there is a caveat, but the caveat has lost the idea of balance. And it also makes it very clear that the items on the right are bad. Now, we didn't discover this, right? The dark manifesto makes fun of this by flipping the values around and making the entire thing rigid and extreme. And the caveat itself is rewritten to say there is no value in the items on the right. And, this came out in 2012. So this isn't new. This isn't a news flash. What we tried to do with Agile 2 was to address this problem head on. And we realized as we went through this 8 months of conversation and intense debate in Google Docs and Slack and going back and forth, we realized that we needed to come up with a better way to explain our philosophy so that this kind of misunderstanding didn't happen. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about what the Agile 2 values actually are.
Lisa?
Before I get it, oh, yes.
Sorry to interrupt you. I just wanted to
go ahead.
You have a question. I did put the link for how they can get some more information, but Arun has a question about, can we join this Agile 2 team to learn and share knowledge? If so, can you provide the link to join? I did type in your Agile 2 net link, but I didn't know if before we got any further, if you could answer that for him.
Oh, sure. No, thank you so much for letting me know.
Yes.
That there was this question, because I have it on the other screen and it's hard to talk and read your speaker notes and watch the chat at the same time. So yes, there is a way. The best way right now to engage in conversation is in the Agile 2 group on LinkedIn. And if you get the slides from, I think Mindy put them in the chat, at the end of the slides, there's a link to that, but you could also just go to LinkedIn and look for the Agile 2 group. It's a private group. You need to request to join, but I think there's like over, I don't even know. Last time I checked, there were over 1,000 people in the group. And they talk about some of these Agile 2 ideas and discuss different aspects of it because, there's a lot to Agile 2 and not everyone agrees with everything, and that's okay. And so sometimes we have these discussions around what we like, what we don't like, or how we're applying these ideas in our organizations and how that's working out, and we share information. So that's a good place to converse about it. The agile2.net website is something we put out, let's see, it would have been a year ago, October, that lists all the values and principles, and also sort of peels back the curtain and shows you like some of the thinking that went into it. So the insights and some of the discussions that we had about what's important, and there's a little bit of an explanation of each principle and some ideas and examples and things like that. So the Agile2.net website is really comprehensive. And then the book is a little different. It's more of a narrative story that talks about lots of examples of companies and organizations and explains the philosophy. So they're all like different ways to learn about and engage with the content and decide for yourself, what you think about it and how much of it is relevant to your situation. Is there another question? I see a couple things in the, yes, the slide.
I will drop, yep, I'll drop them in again. I will also be closer to the end. I will drop in my email in the chat. So if anybody wants to email me, I can email them, just send me an email, and I will also email the slides to anybody that wants them as well. So if that's easier for you guys, if you want them that way, I just dropped my email. I will drop it in there, and I will email them to you tomorrow morning as well.
Okay, thank you for doing that. And I see someone put in a comment that says DevOps need to be built into Agile teams. I agree with that completely. And creating a separate DevOps team has been a fundamental flaw, because the whole concept of DevOps is that everyone's a DevOps person, right? We're all cross-functional, and we have to support the things that we built, and we need to have constant communication. So the whole concept of having a separate DevOps team, I think, speaks to what I was talking about before about how DevOps is really technical, and organizations that aren't as sophisticated, who are new to this and don't understand agility and don't understand DevOps, they think that what they need to do is hire senior DevOps engineers, give them a team, and they've got their problem solved. And I've heard this story from more than one engineer who works at very high levels of organizations like big international banks and stuff. Stories about how that just doesn't work. And anybody who knows anything about DevOps probably can imagine 20 reasons why that's not going to solve major problems. And the organizations that tend to do that are the ones that just don't know very much about either Agile or DevOps. So they get a little confused about what's the best way to solve their problem. All right. Okay, thanks for sharing the slide deck, Mindy. All right, so I'll keep going here and say a little bit about polarity thinking. So the concept of polarity thinking is that you have two opposites on either side, and you travel between them, sort of like a loop-de-loop, and you go too far one way and you go the other. So in this example, as you get more rest, you feel great, you feel like you have a lot of energy, so you take on more and more activity and you get really involved in things, and then you start to get tired, and then you really need to take a break. And if you don't, you will eventually get to burnout, and then you're really going to need to take a break, right? And then you rest, and then you rest and you restore and you recover, and then you go back, and after a while you start to feel bored and restless because you're getting too much rest, and now you're ready for action, so you go back into activity. And the concept of polarity thinking is that rest is not good or bad, and action is not good or bad. Both are needed, and they need to be in balance. That doesn't mean half of each, though. It just means that you're sort of swinging between, you go between one and the other. And the goal there is balance. And the original Agile Manifesto, as I explained before, is really balanced, right? It's important for us to think about this deeply, because the Agile Manifesto, even if we have Agile 2 and Agile 3 and God only knows what other words people will come up with for future theories of how to do all this stuff, but the ground level concept here is that we're trying to figure out how to work with each other better and how to help people work more effectively. And so thinking about the items on the right and the left as polarities really shifts our thinking about it, that we go back and forth, right? So we need comprehensive documentation and we need working software. If we had to choose one and we only got one choice, we would choose working software, but it's never like that in real life. We don't just get one choice, right? We need some documentation and we need the software to work, and we need some documentation, both for our customers perhaps, or for new hires to our organization, or for, I don't know, whatever reason. Maybe it's compliance with laws, but you need that documentation, and it's not a bad or a good thing. It just, you have to have enough, right? You can't spend all your time documenting everything, because then you won't have working software. So that's what I mean when I say, we're trying to bring back balance and thinking about things as being polarities rather than thinking about them as being opposites. And so what we chose to do with the values is to make them both and statements. Now, the original statements were modeled just after the original manifesto statements, and we started to fall into that same old trap where it was a good thing and a bad thing. And so then we shifted our thinking and decided, let's really think of this as polarities instead. And for me personally, where this idea came up was several years ago. I took an improvisation for Agile class from an Agile coach who is a former improvisational actor who used to act professionally on stage. And my key takeaway from that wonderful experience was thinking about both and thinking. And as Agilists, one of our hardest jobs is to hold paradox. And the more I've learned about engineering and DevOps, the more I've seen that it's also true at the advanced levels of computer software engineering, is that you need to allow it to be possible for two superficially contradictory things to both be true. And maybe it's not even superficially, right? Maybe it's just they really seem like they can't both be true. But sometimes there's partial truth to each of them, and there's value in thinking about both of them, and it's not a choice between them, right? So when we put together our values, we use this and format. And let me explain this. Our first one is thoughtfulness and prescription. And here what we mean is it's important to think about the context. You need to understand things before you choose to act, and be thoughtful. And you need to help inexperienced people get going with prescription. Sometimes inexperienced people, they don't need to know and understand every little detail before they can get going. So sometimes it's helpful for them to be prescriptive and say, okay, here's how we're going to do it just for our first go around, right? Because those folks will be supported best with guidance. Another place where I've seen prescription work really well is when there's a serious crisis and very senior engineers need to step in and provide some guidance about how to solve the production outage, and need to be very clear and prescriptive in a way with less experienced people who are somewhat, experiencing maybe more panic and really don't know what to do. So there are environments where being prescriptive is perfectly appropriate, and we need to do it thoughtfully and do it at the appropriate time. We value outcomes and outputs. We constantly hear it's all about good business outcomes or other kinds of desired outcomes. But you don't get outcomes without outputs. So they both matter. And it's not necessarily wrong to measure outputs, but they need to be the ones that are going to lead you to the outcomes that you seek. They're both important. We value individuals and teams. Now, in the Agile space, it's all about teams. But with Agile 2, individuals are also really important. Teams are made up of individual humans and what people need and their working styles, their preferences, their growth, their career development. These things are all really important. And team spirit is very important. So neither is one more important than the other, but at various points in time, or depending on the context in various groups of people, one might be more important than the other. But in general, we want to have them in balance. Now, business understanding and technical understanding. Personally, this is my favorite. To succeed today, technology people really need to understand the business. and they need to, so that they can do good work. They have to make so many decisions throughout the day, large and small. And they will make better decisions if they have a strong understanding of the business context and the business need for whatever it is that they're doing. And business leaders really need to understand and learn about the technology. Now, I've worked with people who say business leaders really don't need to do that because they can just hire good tech people to support them and have them go to it. But if business leaders hope to get the best from their tech teams, they really need to understand how the technology is built, how the technology is delivered. They don't have to become engineers. They don't have to learn the language, the programming languages, and they don't need to learn all the jargon, but they do need to understand enough about what's going on that they can have healthy conversations with their tech leaders, and the two of them can work collaboratively to solve really big problems and achieve their business goals. Individual empowerment and good leadership. We hear a lot about autonomous teams and self-organization, and these are really important because people need to have some kind of control over their work. They need to be able to take chances, try out new ideas, learn from experiments, and be innovative. And at the same time, leadership is really essential, and leaders need to be mindful of how much freedom their people can reasonably handle. Too much autonomy before a person or a team is ready can really backfire. Next is adaptability and planning. And things change so quickly these days that we have no choice but to be extremely adaptable. And if nothing else, the pandemic has taught all of us that we need to be open to rapidly changing in order to move forward and in order to survive. So whether we like it or not, right, we just have to adjust. But that doesn't mean we should throw away our plans and that we should stop planning. Planning is really important because people need to think through what they intend to do, what they want to accomplish, what their goals are, maybe think a little bit about how they're going to do it, think about possibilities for success or failure so that they can be ready for different eventualities. So the planning effort itself is really important. And sometimes you can follow some of those plans. Most of the time you need to change and adapt your plans as you go along, but the planning itself can be really valuable, and both are important. Okay, I am looking at the chat. I see someone made an interesting comment. Ex-DevOps engineer here, now software manager. Our DevOps team seems to be growing further from the practical needs of the engineers who need automation. Yeah. So I think what I've seen happen is people, just human beings generally, right? They become entrenched in their own ideas of what is important and how things should be. And it's hard sometimes, especially when you're dealing with really complex software and computer systems and engineering environments. It's hard to step back and see the big picture because you get so caught up in what we need in order for things not to break and what we need in order to be successful. And what we strove to do with the Agile 2 principles is bring, without actually using the term systems thinking, but is to bring the concepts of systems thinking into it, so that the idea is that you look at the whole picture and balancing out the different parts of the organization, whether it's different teams or the tech, looking closely at what you need and what are the tools that are going to help you be successful. Are you set up in such a way that you can automate things? Is the time it takes to automate considered valuable time well spent because it's going to save so much time later on? I mean, are the people who need to be having those trade-off conversations actually having them? And so what we tried to do with the Agile 2 principles is bring that more holistic view. And that's part of the reason why there's so many of them. There are a lot of them. And we don't expect everyone to read them and follow them or agree with them because Agile 2 is not a framework. It doesn't tell you what to do. It's more of a guide for how to think about things. And the other thing is it's not the last word. Like, we know that people are going to iterate on this and come up with their own ideas and come up with their other sets of ideas that are going to work really well for them. And that's great. The goal here is for Agile 2 principles to be a set of guiding principles and thought-provoking ideas that will help you think through the essence of what it is you're trying to accomplish, and then that will guide you in the direction of what you need to do, and that will be more effective than 12 steps or a model or a system to follow. So there's 43 principles in 8 different categories. So we'll take a look at these category by category. We weren't going to talk about all of them because there's too many. But I did highlight some in yellow that I'm going to speak to a little bit tonight. It doesn't mean they're the most important or my favorites or anything like that. I try to shift these around a little bit sometimes too, because I think they're all really important, but it's too many to share all at once. So I'll just go through some of these, and then this might take around 10 minutes or so, and then I'll pause and we can have a little conversation, have some Q&A. So product design. Product design is really, really important, and a focus on this is often missing as a part of the discussion, believe it or not, in an Agile transformation. And the one here in yellow, those offering products and services should feel accountable to their customers for the impact of defects. I think that's a really deep concept, even though it sounds pretty simple and it's like, well, of course. But I've seen environments where people get farther and farther away from thinking about the impact on their users or their customers of the decisions that they're making. And it's not their fault, right? It's not the individual who's choosing to do that. It's usually something systemic in the organization, or the way that the teams are set up, how they employ or don't employ UX designers and so forth. But in Agile 2, we really think product design is essential and is front and center because it's the bedrock of what we're doing. If we can't design products that users love and want and that solve their problems for them or help them or entertain them, whatever it is we're trying to do, then we're not going to succeed, and nothing else we do really matters because nobody's going to use our stuff. So we really need to bake product design into the organization's DNA and have it be part of the lifeblood of the reason why the organization exists in the first place. Data is sometimes an afterthought and is not directly addressed in any of the Agile frameworks and models that I've seen. And maybe there's something new that I haven't seen or something I've missed, which is always possible. But typically data tends to be minimized, and we think that data has strategic value and that gathering good data is really essential to success. And here I'm not just talking about product data, it's also business data. It can be all kinds of data relevant to your systems and your products and your services and your business. And having that data be highly visible so that that's what we mean when we say the organization's information model, like how you display it in dashboards, how you share it, how you use it to make decisions. That's all really vitally important to an organization's success. And we have a lot of leadership principles, and it's not because we're trying to be the be all or end all or anything like that on leadership. I mean, there's tons of great books written on the topic, and we weren't trying to be exhaustive here. But the more we talked as a group over that 8-month period, the more various kinds of aspects of leadership emerged again and again and again. And they're just really important. And I think it's really important that an organization have an intentional leadership model, because their leadership model will determine everything else that happens in the organization. It really can be no other way. Leaders are role models. People imitate their behavior. They're, like, to use a metaphor, they're like parents, right? They have to display the values and the behavior that they ask of other people. They can't be in the position of saying, do as I say, not as I do, because it won't work. People are really smart. They see through that really quickly. They look to their leaders and they imitate what they see their leaders doing. They copy their leaders, or they adopt their leaders' belief systems, and they ignore what their leaders actually say to them. So if the leader's behavior is not aligned with the values that the leader says they hold, people will have to choose. And they will choose to follow and imitate the behavior every time, because that's just how people are. It's kind of hardwired into us as human beings. And so it's really important for organizations to think through how they want to handle this whole area of leadership. Now, intentional, thoughtful leadership is what I'm talking about here. And this can vary dramatically depending on the circumstances. But for example, a team needs some direction, right? It doesn't matter if you're talking about a team of individual contributors or a team of senior managers or senior executives. A team is a team, and all teams need leadership. And this is what we mean when we say leadership models scale. And before I go further, I want to make a crucial point. There is no perfect form of leadership. Every organization actually needs many different kinds of leadership and different types of leadership. So Agile 2 suggests that a team has more than one type of leader, and some of these will be in formal roles, some will be in positions of authority, others will be informal leaders who everyone on the team knows is a leader in a certain way or a certain area, and all those forms of leadership are really important. And so, having an environment where you can encourage the emergence of these different type of leadership is really important. And these are from various leadership thinkers. Peter Drucker says that an organization needs an outside person and an inside person and someone who gets things done. And these are very different leadership traits and leadership styles, and you rarely see them all in the same person. And the Agile community tends to share a collective view in general that leaders will emerge. And I do believe that leaders will emerge. The question is, do those leaders have the necessary and needed skills and leadership qualities at that moment? And the evidence from leadership research shows that yes, leaders do emerge, but they may not be the ones that you need. They might not have the right traits. They might be a little too commanding. They might be a little too arrogant. They might be, whatever, a lot of things. And so in Agile 2, we support the idea of intentional leadership, which is thinking through these things. When the right type of leadership emerges, support it, celebrate it, foster it, encourage it, because that's what's needed for the group and the organization to be successful. And make sure that all teams have the different types of leadership that they need at different points in time, which is not going to be static, right? Even if you have the same group of people working together over a period of time, they're not going to have the same leadership needs all the time. So it's just important for someone to be thinking about this, right? Do they have the right kinds of leadership, and do they have what they need to be successful? Now, one of the things we hear very often associated with Agile is self-organizing teams and the role of a Scrum Master as a servant leader. But there needs to be a lot more to it than that, I think, in my experience. Now, this essay by Jo Freeman, this came out in 1970, and she was a women's activist, and she wrote, "There is no such thing as a structureless group. Any group of people, any group of people of whatever nature that comes together for any length of time, for any purpose, will inevitably structure itself in some fashion. Structurelessness becomes a way of making power. As long as the structure of the group is informal, the rules of how decisions are made are known only to a few, and awareness of power is limited to those who know the rules." Now, the Manifesto's statement about self-organization is a rejection of autocratic micromanagement. And we can all agree that that is not a good thing and doesn't help anybody accomplish much of anything. Self-organization, on the other hand, doesn't necessarily fix the problem, because a structure will emerge that could be harmful. So what we need are the right people in the right leadership roles, And when I say roles here, I mean it very loosely. I don't mean necessarily in a formal title or a formal position with official representation in some org chart, but that groups have the right type of leadership that they need for the circumstances, and that someone in the system is paying attention to the need for this kind of open approach to leadership, and making sure not that you have a certain type of leadership or that you have an individual who's in charge. Instead, it's more the idea of someone who understands these different aspects of leadership and ensures that squads have what they need. Now, one of Agile 2's principles is that good leaders are open. And that means that leaders need to listen before they give orders, if they ever give orders at all. Good leaders actually rarely give orders, because just because you have authority doesn't mean you actually use it. You may not use it much at all or very sparingly, because people really need agency over how they do their work. That's how you unleash their creativity. But when issues arise that transcend the team, that no one on the team, because of the circumstances of the larger system, is able to address, then a good leader knows how to deal with those issues and how to get the team the support that it needs. A good leader will take these larger circumstances into account and will also be thinking about issues that might be internal just to that team. All right, frameworks, talked a little bit about that earlier, so I won't say too much here. But the core idea of Agile 2 regarding frameworks is that they all need to be tailored for the circumstances, and that implementing frameworks out of the box without tailoring them or thinking about how they suit, or for that matter, changing what you do over time, because you might, if you're brand new, you might implement something right out of the box at the beginning because you're just getting started, but then as you work with it over time, you realize maybe we can adjust this or can adjust that to something that's going to be more effective for you. So the real question here is what's going to work well for you, not so much following a set of rules. They can be a good starting point, and if you're getting great results and everyone's really happy, by all means, stick with what you're doing. You don't need to change just for change's sake, but to be open to the idea that you might need to adjust your frameworks as you go along. All right. Agile 2 ideas around workflow align really closely with Lean. Things that slow us down really harm us. And we need to be alert all the time for causes for delay and to address them. I think I talked a little bit about this already, which is this idea of having both technical fluency and business fluency in the organization, and especially in the leadership. I think it's self-evident to people who are actually in the weeds working with tech or are in tech leadership. It's self-evident that business people need to understand what is going on. But sometimes I think business leaders think that they can effectively outsource managing all the tech. And when they do that, they can sometimes continue to make decisions and devise strategies and make demands of their teams that completely contradict the things that the tech teams need in order to be successful. And that kind of speaks to that one comment somebody wrote earlier about DevOps teams not being implemented properly. It's like, well, the business leaders, whoever is responsible, has the authority and the money to pay all these people, because DevOps engineers are not cheap, needs to understand what they're doing enough to deploy them effectively. Okay, and planning and transformation. Most of our ideas around, all of our ideas around transformation are pretty common sense, especially if you're an engineer or you're an expert in DevOps. It's easy to lose sight of the conditions needed for bringing about change in an organization. So if you happen to be in an organization that's transforming, and by that I mean they have some kind of formal and official transformation effort going on, then it's important for everyone in the organization to be willing to learn, because really a transformation is a learning journey. And it doesn't really happen through a step-by-step process. It happens more of a deeper change in the heart, where people learn to see things differently and to think differently, and they're open to new ideas. And that takes some time, and it takes a lot of, I don't want to say education, but learning. Like people, sometimes it's self-directed learning. People need to do their own research. But most of the time, what it means is running small experiments, trying things out, seeing how it works, taking blame out of the equation, being able to learn from our experiments and learn from our failures, and ensure that the top leadership is on board with this concept so that they don't inadvertently undermine the learning in their organization by any kind of subtle or not so subtle punishments of people who run experiments and fail, right? When you try something out and it doesn't work, then you've learned from it. And the idea with Agile is you, and DevOps to some extent, you try small experiments. You don't try great big experiments that are going to cause a catastrophe if they fail. You run small experiments and you learn as you go, and then you apply that learning and you share that learning. And that learning process, it doesn't happen in organization where there's a lot of blame. And so you need to take blame out of the equation and create a healthy environment. And finally, Agile 2 really focuses on people as individuals and as humans, and also as part of a team. Like one of the most common complaints I hear is that there are just too many meetings. I talked about that a little earlier. I've even heard some engineers say that they have to work nights and weekends just to get their essential work done because their days are just too full of meetings. They can't get anything done. And I mean, I think that's just completely crazy. I mean, people require sufficient focus time to do their work and really concentrate on the very difficult problems that they're trying to solve. So Agile 2 principles around people tend to emphasize the need for focus time, for flow, for people to be able to really feel valued as individuals, supported in their career development, supported in their growth and learning, and for them to be able to experiment, like I said before, without blame, so that there's an environment of psychological safety. And this is how it is that we get the best creativity and, by the way, the best productivity, right? And wonderful things can happen with teams of individuals who are supported in this way. I've seen it happen. All right. So this is the slide I mentioned before. You can go to agile2.net and learn more about how we came up with the principles and the ideas behind them. There's a conversation on LinkedIn, and there's a link here to the book, which is on Amazon if you want to find out more about it. Okay. I'm going to take a look at the chat, see if any questions came up. Somebody mentioned they'd like to connect with me via LinkedIn. I'm pretty easy to find on LinkedIn. I'm just Lisa Cooney. I was an early adopter and got my actual name in there somehow. And somebody else asked for a link to the slides. Maybe Mindy, could you drop those slides in the chat window again for Yvette?
Yes, of course. I will drop them in, and I will also drop in my email for anybody that wants to just email me as well, and I will get them out to everybody who emails me in the morning as well.
Okay. Somehow I've got red lines on my screen. Can you guys see that? I think I did that by accident. All right, I'm going to stop sharing now. And I'm going to move the chat over so that I can see it a little better. See what we've got here. Oh, someone requested to save the chat. Let me see if I can do that. I think with Zoom, sometimes you need to be a host in order to save the chat. Is that right?
Yeah, and it does not allow us to. So.
Oh, really?
Well, it allows us to, but with the settings that we have, it's not to allow anyone else to
yeah,
do it.
Yeah, everybody's different. All right, I'm gonna download the chat. Oh no, that didn't work. No, it doesn't let you cut and paste either. Whew.
And we do have, David has a message. What is your advice about evolving management in agile space?
Yeah, so there's a whole field evolving rapidly called Agile Management. Sometimes people say Agile Project Management. There's the Agile PMO for Program Management Office. So people are really exploring this idea. And personally, what I've seen happen has been kind of fascinating through the pandemic. It's become abundantly clear that we can't keep doing things the way we've been doing them, and we need to be more flexible and adaptable. We need to be able to handle change more effectively and respond. And leaders are realizing that they need to do these things, and the ones who didn't know about it before go out and do some research and discover this whole literature on business agility and agile and a lot of these concepts depending on the type of organization that they run, and they're starting to get really curious about it, and there's some very interesting blog posts and articles, so you can sort of do some research on that. I don't really have any very specific current recent management books. I have some specifically for Agile. Like there's Management 3.0 with Jürgen Appello wrote a few years ago about managing for happiness. And since then, I know there's been some research done on this, which is that if you measure productivity and customer delight and employee happiness, those three things tend to rise and fall in tandem. And once organizational leaders realize that, some of them have decided that the only thing they're going to bother to measure is employee happiness, because they know that if the employees are happy, productivity will go up and their customers will be much happier with their products and services. And so why bother measuring all that other stuff? You just look at how happy your employees are, make sure they're happy, and things flow from there. So these are some of the concepts that come in with Agile management. It's really a very different way of thinking about things if you're a traditional hierarchical manager who's come up through the ranks. But I think that what the one side benefit of the pandemic has been that it has enabled a lot of people to step out of their comfort zone. Like it or not, they had no choice, and to start looking around for resources to help them figure this out. And luckily, there are a lot of great resources out there. Is an ebook? Yes, an ebook is available for the Agile 2 book on Kindle. I don't think there's an audiobook version of it. Oh, and somebody's joking about those red lines. I didn't even know I was drawing them. I looked over and I saw them. Build, measure, learn should always be part of your organization's operating model. I agree with that. Somebody said something that I thought was interesting. Oh, somebody wrote, these are problems faced by some teams. So I don't have a lot of context for that comment, but what came to mind when I read it was when this 15 people got together for 8 months in all different ways to talk about these things. Occasionally somebody would come up with a new idea or describe a problem and say, here's how I think we should deal with that problem. And somebody else would say, well, I've never seen that problem. And we all quickly realized, well, that doesn't mean the problem isn't real. That doesn't mean the problem didn't happen, because all teams are different and all teams face different types of problems. So by having such a diverse group, we attempted anyway to articulate and address as many problems as we could come up with, but I'm sure we missed others. That was Namrata. You're welcome to, all of you, by the way, are welcome to unmute and ask a question if you'd like to.
Also, for anyone that's, before anybody unmutes really quick, anybody that is asking, yes, the recording will be shared to anybody that is registered through Eventbrite. If you are not registered through Eventbrite and you want the recording emailed to you, feel free to once again email me, and I will email you the link to our YouTube on there, and I will just email it to you as well, just so you guys know. Okay?
Reminds me of the Santa Claus exchange. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Yep. Well, thanks for being here tonight. You guys have been a really terrific audience.